There are places on this earth where the ground itself seems to remember what we have forgotten. Places where stone stands in defiance of everything we thought we knew about who we were, what we could do, and when we learned to do it. These are not ruins in the way we usually imagine ruins. Crumbled walls slowly surrendering to time, monuments wearing down to nothing under wind and rain. No, these are structures that refuse to be dismissed, megaliths that should not exist, engineering that predates the civilizations we credit with inventing engineering, precision cuts in stone that modern diamond-tipped machinery struggles to replicate, and perhaps most unsettling of all, an institutional silence, a strange reluctance to confront what these anomalies actually mean for the story we tell ourselves about human history. Consider for a moment the textbooks you encountered in school, the neat progression of human development they laid out with such confidence. First came the wandering hunter-gatherers, small bands of humans following game across the landscape, living hand to mouth, incapable of anything beyond survival. Then, slowly, came agriculture, the domestication of plants and animals that allowed permanent settlement. Only after this agricultural revolution, we were told, could complex society emerge. Only with surplus food could there be specialists, priests, builders, artists. Only with cities could there be temples. Only with writing could there be civilization. The timeline was clean, logical, reassuring. And it was wrong. Everything we thought we understood about this progression shattered in the summer of 1994, on a dusty hillside in southeastern Turkey, when a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt began excavating a site that should not have existed. The locals called it Göbekli Tepe, the hill with a belly, and for centuries farmers had ploughed around the strange limestone slabs that poked through the soil, assuming they were nothing more than medieval grave markers. American researchers had briefly surveyed the site in the 1960s and dismissed it, seeing only scattered rocks on an unremarkable hill. But Schmidt saw something different. He saw deliberate arrangement. He saw intentionality carved into stone. And when he started digging, what emerged from beneath that unassuming hill rewrote the first chapter of human civilization. Picture the landscape as it exists today, the rolling plains of the Harran Plateau stretching toward the Syrian border, wheat fields rippling in the dry wind, a sky so vast it seems to press down upon the earth. The hill rises gently from this terrain, perhaps 50 feet higher than its surroundings, covered in sparse grass and scattered stones. Nothing about it announces what lies beneath. Nothing prepares you for what Schmidt and his team gradually uncovered over the following decades. A temple complex so massive, so sophisticated, and so impossibly old that it forced archaeologists to question everything they thought they knew about prehistoric humanity. The first structures to emerge were circles of enormous T-shaped limestone pillars, some standing over 16 feet tall and weighing between 40 and 60 tons. These were not rough megaliths crudely stacked atop one another. These were carefully carved monoliths, their surfaces smoothed and shaped with unmistakable precision, their forms clearly anthropomorphic. The T-shape representing a stylized human figure, arms folded across a body, the horizontal slab suggesting a head turned sideways, facing something we cannot see. And covering these pillars, carved in low relief with tools that should not have existed at this time, were images of the animal world, foxes with knowing eyes, vultures spreading their wings, wild boars with bristled backs, scorpions, serpents, spiders, cranes, lions. Not abstract symbols, not primitive scratches, detailed, accomplished, deliberately arranged representations of creatures that clearly held profound meaning for their creators. Dating techniques confirmed what Schmidt could barely believe. The oldest structures at Göbekli Tepe were built around 9600 BCE, nearly 12,000 years ago. To grasp how staggering this is, consider that the Great Pyramids of Giza would not rise for another 7,000 years. Stonehenge would not see its first stones erected for another 6,000 years. The wheel had not been invented. Metal tools did not exist. Agriculture, according to every model we had constructed, had not yet emerged in this region. Writing was still more than 5 millennia in the future. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were, by every conventional definition, primitive hunter-gatherers, nomadic bands with no permanent settlements, no centralized authority, no accumulated wealth, no specialized labor force. And yet here stood a monument requiring the coordinated effort of hundreds, possibly thousands of workers over generations. Here stood architecture demanding sophisticated knowledge of quarrying, engineering, transportation, and construction. Here stood artistic achievement suggesting a complex symbolic language, a shared cosmology, a priestly class capable of directing collective labour towards something beyond mere survival. The contradiction was absolute. Either everything we believed about prehistoric humans was wrong, or Göbekli Tepe could not exist. But it does exist. The stone stands. The carvings endure. The impossibility refuses to dissolve. Ground-penetrating radar surveys have since revealed that what Schmidt excavated represents perhaps 5% of what lies beneath that unassuming hill. Dozens of additional stone circles remain buried, their pillars still standing exactly where they were placed 12,000 years ago, their carvings preserved by the earth that has hidden them since antiquity. The site is not a single structure, but an entire complex, a place of sustained ceremonial activity spanning centuries, perhaps millennia, before it was finally sealed. And this brings us to perhaps the most haunting aspect of Göbekli Tepe, a detail that archaeologists cannot explain and that receives remarkably little attention in popular discussions of the site. Sometime around 8000 BCE, after the complex had been in use for roughly 2000 years, the people who built it deliberately buried it, not abandoned it, not left it to crumble under the weight of time. They systematically, intentionally, laboriously filled in their stone circles with thousands of tons of debris, dirt, broken stone, animal bones, refuse, until every pillar was covered, every carved surface hidden, the entire monumental complex transformed back into an ordinary-looking hill. They erased their own achievement from the landscape. Why? What could possibly motivate such an act? Consider the effort involved, carrying earth and rubble to fill structures the size of houses, packing it around pillars that had stood for 20 centuries, ensuring that future generations would see nothing but a gentle rise in the terrain. This was not hasty destruction. This was not the work of invaders desecrating a conquered temple. This was deliberate concealment by the builders themselves or their direct descendants, performed with the same organizational sophistication that had raised the stones in the first place. They wanted Göbekli Tepe hidden. They wanted it forgotten. Some researchers speculate that the burial was ritualistic, a sacred site reaching the end of its spiritual usefulness, sealed away like a king interred with his treasures. Others suggest something darker, that whatever knowledge or power the site represented had become dangerous, that the complex needed to be locked away from future generations for reasons we cannot comprehend. Still others point to climate shifts, changing social structures, the transition from hunting to farming that transformed the region in the following millennia. But these are guesses. The truth is that we do not know. We may never know. The builders left no writing, no explanation, no key to unlock the meaning of what they created and why they chose to hide it. What we do know is this: Göbekli Tepe should not exist according to our models of prehistory, and its existence has not been fully integrated into those models. Textbooks have been slow to change. The implications remain largely unconfronted. How did hunter-gatherers coordinate labour on this scale, without agriculture, without cities, without the surplus food that supposedly enabled complex society? Where did they acquire the engineering knowledge to quarry, transport and erect 60-ton pillars? What symbolic system produced the elaborate animal iconography, and what did it mean? Why does the site predate every comparable monument by thousands of years, standing alone at the dawn of civilization like a lighthouse, whose beacon we cannot interpret? The questions multiply the longer one stands before those ancient stones. The answers remain as buried as the site itself was for 10,000 years. From the wind-scoured hills of southeastern Turkey, we turn our attention to a different kind of impossibility, one found not at the dawn of temple building, but at the ceiling of the world itself. Nearly 13,000 feet above sea level, in the thin air of the Bolivian Altiplano, lies a ruin that looks less like ancient architecture and more like the aftermath of an industrial accident. Scattered across the high plateau, half buried in the coarse grass and wind-blown dust, are stone blocks of such precision that they seem to mock the very idea of primitive technology. This is Puma Punku, the door of the Puma, a structure that has baffled engineers, archaeologists and curious visitors for centuries. The site sits adjacent to the larger ruins of Tiwanaku, once the capital of a pre-Incan civilization that flourished in this harsh landscape between roughly 300 and 1000 CE. But Pumapunku defies easy categorization within that timeline. Some researchers believe its oldest components predate the Tiwanaku culture entirely, dating back perhaps 15,000 years or more, a claim that mainstream archaeology largely dismisses but cannot fully disprove. What is beyond dispute is the staggering quality of the stonework. Whatever tools created these blocks, whatever hands guided those tools, possessed capabilities that continue to elude modern explanation. Imagine standing among these ruins as the sun rises over the Altiplano, the sky above bleeding from purple to gold, the temperature still hovering near freezing despite the morning light. The landscape stretches flat and almost featureless in every direction. Brown grass, distant mountains capped with snow, the great expanse of Lake Titicaca shimmering on the northeastern horizon. In this austere setting, the stone blocks lie scattered like the pieces of a puzzle no one can solve. Some are enormous, the largest weighing an estimated 130 tons, the equivalent of roughly 60 full-sized automobiles compressed into a single piece of red sandstone. Others are smaller but no less remarkable, their surfaces machined to tolerances that would satisfy a modern engineer. The most famous blocks at Pumapunku are the H-shaped stones, identical pieces that interlock with one another like sophisticated building components, their recessed channels and protruding flanges designed to fit together without mortar. Run your hand along their surfaces and you feel something impossible. Perfectly flat planes extending for several feet without the slightest deviation. Right angles so precise they could have been cut with lasers, corners so sharp they could draw blood. These are not the rough-hewn blocks of medieval castles or even the finely fitted stones of Machu Picchu. These are components manufactured to industrial specifications by a civilization that possessed no written language, no iron tools, and no wheel. The drill holes compound the mystery. Dozens of the blocks feature small circular holes bored into their surfaces with remarkable regularity. Identical in diameter, evenly spaced, their interiors showing the spiral grooves characteristic of rotary drilling. Some researchers have attempted to replicate these holes using bronze or copper tools, materials available to the Tiwanaku culture. The results have been underwhelming. The softer metals wear down too quickly, the drilling takes far too long, and the precision falls far short of what the ancient builders achieved. Whatever technique they used, it left marks that modern drills would recognize, but ancient technology should not have been capable of producing. Then there is the question of the stone itself. The largest blocks at Pumapunku are red sandstone, quarried from a location roughly 6 miles away, a considerable distance to transport objects weighing more than 100 tons across terrain with no paved roads. But the smaller, more precisely cut blocks are made of diorite and andesite, volcanic stones of extraordinary hardness. Andesite rates between 6 and 7 on the Mohs hardness scale, harder than steel, harder than iron, harder than any metal tool available to the Tiwanaku culture. Yet the blocks were somehow cut, shaped, drilled, and polished to mirror smooth finishes. The conventional explanation involves pounding the stone with harder stone tools, an extraordinarily labour-intensive process that would have taken years for even a single block. The unconventional explanations venture into territory that mainstream archaeology refuses to acknowledge. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of the site have revealed additional mysteries beneath the surface. An extensive network of underground chambers, conduits, and channels lies buried beneath Pumapunku and the surrounding Tiwanaku complex. Some appear to have carried water, suggesting a sophisticated hydraulic system whose purpose remains unclear. Were these for irrigation, sanitation, ritual purification, or something else entirely? The surveyed structures extend far beyond what has been excavated, hinting at a subterranean complex of considerable size and sophistication. Whatever lies down there, the builders chose to construct it underground, hidden from the sky, connected to the surface structures in ways we have only begun to map. The Tiwanaku civilization that officially built Pumapunku declined and ultimately collapsed sometime around 1000 CE, likely due to prolonged drought that made agriculture on the high plateau unsustainable. The people dispersed, their descendants absorbed into later cultures, their knowledge scattered and eventually lost. By the time the Inca Empire rose to power several centuries later, Pumapunku was already a ruin, a strange collection of impossibly precise stones that even the Inca, themselves accomplished builders, could not explain. When Spanish conquistadors asked the local people who had built these structures, the answer was always the same. They did not know. The stones had been there forever. They had been placed by the gods, or by giants, or by beings from the stars. The truth had been forgotten. What remains is stone, and stone does not forget. Every drill hole, every machined surface, every interlocking component testifies to knowledge that existed and then vanished. The Spanish dismantled much of Tiwanaku for building materials, but Pumapunku's blocks proved too hard, too heavy, too precisely shaped to be easily repurposed. They were left where they lay, too difficult to move, too strange to explain, silent witnesses to a capability we no longer understand. Modern architects and engineers have studied the site, attempted to replicate the cuts and finishes using contemporary tools, and emerged with more questions than answers. The precision is reproducible today, but only with diamond-tipped saws, CNC machines, and sophisticated measuring instruments. Without those technologies, achieving what the Tiwanaku achieved seems functionally impossible, yet they achieved it. The blocks exist. The drill holes spiral into the stone. The 8 shapes interlock with mechanical perfection. Whatever tools, whatever knowledge, whatever organizational system produced Pumapunku, it arose in one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth, at elevations where lowlanders struggle to breathe, among people who left no written record of their techniques. And then it vanished. The knowledge did not travel. The methods were not passed down. The precision died with its masters, leaving behind only the stone and the questions the stone asks of everyone who encounters it. From the heights of the Andes, we descend now, not to sea level, but far beneath it. Beneath the surface of the earth itself, into darkness that has waited since before the Roman Empire, since before Alexander, since before memory. In 1963, in a small town in central Turkey, a man was renovating his home. The details of his name, his circumstances, his reasons for remodelling have been lost to time, swallowed by the vastness of what his renovation uncovered. He knocked down a wall in his basement, expecting to find earth, bedrock, perhaps an old foundation. Instead, he found a tunnel, and behind that tunnel lay the entrance to an underground city that could shelter 20,000 people. The town is Derinkuyu, a word that means deep well in Turkish, a name that proves itself with every level one descends into the rock. The entrance is unremarkable, a doorway in a courtyard that could lead to any cellar in any village across Anatolia. But the stairs that wind downward from that doorway do not end. They spiral, they branch, they open into chambers and reconverge into corridors. They descend through level after level of carved volcanic tuff, until the surface seems impossibly distant, until the light from above has long since faded into memory, until you stand in rooms where no natural light has penetrated for thousands of years. 18 stories. That is how deep Derinkuyu plunges into the earth. Approximately 280 feet of vertical descent, carved entirely from the soft volcanic rock by hand tools that left their marks still visible on the walls. The city sprawls outward at each level, chambers connecting to chambers, corridors extending for hundreds of meters before rejoining the central shafts, the entire complex organized with unmistakable intentionality. This was not a cave that humans adapted to their needs. This was a city designed from nothing, carved downward into solid rock, planned and executed over what must have been generations of continuous labor. The purpose reveals itself through the architecture. Kitchens with smoke-blackened ceilings, their ventilation shafts rising hundreds of feet to openings on the surface disguised as ordinary wells. Stables for livestock, their walls worn smooth by the rubbing of animal flanks, their floors still bearing the depressions where troughs once stood. Schools where children learned whatever the surface world would not teach them. Churches with cruciform floor plans, their ceilings carved into domes, their altars positioned beneath shafts that channel sound upward in uncanny ways. Wineries where grapes were pressed and fermented, the rock-cut vats still stained purple after millennia. Storage rooms for grain, for oil, for water drawn from wells that penetrated aquifers far below even the lowest habitable level. And everywhere, the doors. Massive circular stones, some weighing nearly half a ton, positioned at strategic points throughout the labyrinth. These doors could be rolled into place to seal the corridors, but they were designed with a critical asymmetry. They could only be locked from the inside. From without, they were immovable. An army could stand in those passages and hammer against those stone wheels for days without gaining access to the chambers beyond. Derinkuyu was not merely a place to live underground. It was a fortress designed to resist siege from above. The ventilation system alone represents an engineering achievement that defies easy explanation. Over 50 shafts penetrate from the surface down through the levels, carrying fresh air to the deepest chambers and exhausting stale air upward. The design accounts for the natural tendency of warm air to rise, creating a circulation system that does not require mechanical assistance. People lived for months in these depths, bringing their animals, their children, their stored food down into the darkness, and they survived because someone understood how air moves through a three-dimensional maze carved from stone. Who built this place? When? And what were they hiding from? The official explanation points to the Phrygians, an ancient Anatolian people who flourished in the 1st millennium BCE, with later expansions by the Byzantines, who used the underground cities as refuges during Arab raids in the 7th and 8th centuries CE. The soft volcanic tuff of Cappadocia does lend itself to carving. The region is famous for its cave churches and troglodyte dwellings. But the scale of Derinkuyu exceeds anything practical defence would require. Its deepest levels, its most elaborate chambers, its massive infrastructure all suggest something more than a temporary refuge from raiding parties. Some researchers believe the core of the city is far older than the Phrygians, that the deepest levels date back to the Hittites, or even earlier, to peoples whose names have been lost to history. Others point to geological evidence suggesting the tunnels may predate the volcanic ash that formed the region's distinctive rock, though this claim remains controversial. What is certain is that the official timeline cannot account for the labour involved. Carving 280 feet of city from solid rock, disposing of the excavated material, supporting the population of workers during the decades or centuries of construction. All of this implies organisation, resources and motivation on a scale that prehistory was supposedly incapable of producing. The connection to other underground cities deepens the mystery. Derinkuyu is not alone. Over 200 underground structures have been identified in the Cappadocian region, ranging from small refuges to massive complexes rivaling Derinkuyu itself. The nearby underground city of Kemakli connects to Derinkuyu through a tunnel extending more than 5 miles beneath the surface. 5 miles of corridor carved through rock, connecting two buried cities, suggesting not isolated refuges but an integrated network, a civilization that lived as much beneath the earth as upon it. What drove them underground? The defensive features suggest fear of something on the surface so terrifying that entire populations chose to live in darkness rather than face it. The scale suggests permanence, not a temporary hiding place but a parallel existence, maintained for generations. The secrecy suggests something even stranger. Whatever happened in these depths was meant to be hidden, protected, separated from the world above. Local legends speak of the cities as refuges from demons, from invaders, from plagues. Early Christian communities certainly used them to hide from Roman persecution and later from Islamic conquest. But the cities predate Christianity. Their oldest levels predate written history. Whatever fear first drove people to carve cities from the rock, it was a fear old enough to be forgotten, old enough that even the descendants of the builders could not remember what their ancestors had been fleeing. Walking through Derinkuyu today, down the spiralling staircases lit only by electric bulbs recently installed for tourists, the walls pressing close, the ceiling low enough to brush against your head, the air cool and still and faintly damp. Something deeper than claustrophobia settles in. It is the awareness of weight. Not just the rock above, though that weight is immense, but the weight of time, the weight of all those generations who lived here, who were born here, who died here, who knew secrets about the world above that we can only guess at. The walls bear the marks of their tools, the floors are worn smooth by their feet, but they left no explanation, no record, no key to unlock the meaning of what they created. The doors still roll, the ventilation shafts still breathe. The city waits, as it has waited for millennia, for someone to descend with questions it can no longer answer. We leave the darkness beneath Turkey's plains for a darkness of a different kind. The darkness of the open Pacific, where ocean meets sky in an unbroken circle of blue, where the nearest continent lies thousands of miles away, where isolation should have made complex civilization impossible. Yet on a tiny island called Pohnpei, in the trackless waters of Micronesia, rises something that should not be there. A city built on the sea itself, constructed from hundreds of thousands of tons of volcanic basalt, assembled on 92 artificial islands spread across a lagoon where coral grows and tides rise and fall. This is Nan Madol, the place of the in-between, and everything about it defies the explanations we have been given. The setting alone strains belief. Pohnpei is a speck of volcanic rock, roughly 14 miles across at its widest point, surrounded by a coral reef that creates a shallow lagoon along its eastern shore. In this lagoon, beginning sometime around the 1st century CE and continuing for over 1,000 years, the Sodelur dynasty built a ceremonial capital unlike anything else in the Pacific. They did not build on land. They built on water, or rather on platforms they created in the water, stacking basalt logs like Lincoln logs until artificial islands rose above the tidal reach, then constructing tombs and temples and residences on these foundations. The basalt itself came from quarries on the opposite side of the island, where volcanic activity had created columnar formations, natural hexagonal pillars of dark stone that fracture into segments when disturbed. Some of these segments are relatively small, manageable by a few strong workers. Others weigh 20, 30, 50 tons, columns of solid rock 15 feet long or longer. These massive pieces were somehow extracted from the quarry, transported 25 miles around the island's circumference, ferried across open water, and precisely positioned to form the walls and foundations of the city. No roads connected the quarries to the construction site. No harbour facilities have been found. No evidence of rollers, levers, sleds, or rafts capable of carrying such weight has ever been discovered. The logistics are essentially impossible. Move 50 tons of stone across a jungle-covered volcanic island without roads, then load it onto watercraft without piers or cranes, then navigate it through coral-infested waters to a construction site where it must be unloaded, again without infrastructure, and positioned with precision atop a growing platform of previously placed stones. Multiply this process by hundreds of thousands of individual stones across 92 separate islands over a construction period that archaeologists estimate lasted centuries. The labour involved exceeds anything the island's population could reasonably have sustained. The engineering knowledge implies sophistication that left no trace in the archaeological record. The motivation remains as mysterious as the methods. Nan Madol was not a practical city. No one grew food there. The artificial islands have no soil, no fresh water, no agricultural potential whatsoever. No craft production has been identified. No markets, no workshops, no evidence of the daily economic activity that sustains urban populations. The city was exclusively ceremonial, a place where the Sodelur priest-kings conducted rituals, housed their dead, and maintained whatever power structure allowed them to command the resources necessary for such construction. To live in Nan Madol, you had to bring everything from the main island: food, water, fuel, materials for repair. The city consumed without producing. Its existence was pure expenditure, pure display, pure devotion to purposes we can only dimly perceive. The Sodelur dynasty that built Nan Madol ruled Pohnpei for over a millennium, a theocratic regime that oral histories describe as increasingly oppressive and demanding. Around 1628 CE, according to those same histories, the dynasty was overthrown by an invader named Archaeological, who established a new ruling line and abandoned Nan Madol to the tides. Within a generation, the city was empty. Within centuries, the jungle and the sea began to reclaim it. Today, the basalt walls rise from the water like the ruins of a drowned civilization, the spaces between them choked with mangroves, the interiors flooded at high tide, the carefully stacked stones slowly surrendering to salt and wave and time. Local tradition is unambiguous about how the city was built. The twin sorcerers Olisipa and Olosopa, who came from somewhere to the west, levitated the basalt logs through magic. They flew the stones through the air on the backs of a great dragon, or they commanded the stones to move themselves, or they possessed powers that transcended the physical limitations we accept as absolute. These are not folk tales told to entertain children. These are explanations offered by people whose ancestors built the city, passed down through generations of oral transmission, preserved with the reverence accorded to sacred history. The stones were moved by magic because no other explanation makes sense. Archaeologists dismiss these accounts as mythology, the inevitable embellishment of memory over time. But they have not provided a convincing alternative. Experimental archaeology has attempted to replicate the transportation and construction methods using techniques available to the Sodalur culture: log rollers, rattan ropes, wooden rafts, coordinated human labour. The results have been discouraging. Moving even the smaller stones proves extraordinarily difficult. Moving the largest columns is, for all practical purposes, impossible without modern equipment. The estimates for labour and time required to build Nan Madol using available methods stretch into centuries of continuous work by thousands of labourers, a commitment that the island's population and agricultural base could not have sustained. The underwater surveys have revealed additional mysteries. The artificial islands visible above water represent only part of the construction. Beneath the surface, the foundation structures extend far deeper than necessary for stability, suggesting either overbuilding of remarkable proportions or submergence of formerly exposed platforms. Some researchers have speculated that the earliest construction at Nan Madol predates the current sea level, that the original builders worked on land that has since been inundated, that the city is far older than the official timeline allows. This hypothesis remains controversial, but the underwater structures are real, and they demand explanation. The people of Pohnpei do not visit Nan Madol at night. This is not superstition passed down from credulous ancestors. This is a prohibition observed by modern Pohnpeians who work professional jobs, drive cars, use smartphones, and in every other respect participate in the 21st century. They know the stories. They have heard the accounts of lights moving among the ruins after dark, of voices calling from empty chambers, of visitors who stayed past sunset and emerged changed, shaken, unwilling to describe what they experienced. The city is Kapu, forbidden, sacred, dangerous. Whatever power the Sodalur priests channeled through their architecture, the locals believe it has not entirely faded. We are left with stone and water and silence. Massive basalt columns rising from the Pacific Lagoon, stacked with precision by hands that left no record of their methods, serving purposes that left no record of their meaning. A city that should have been impossible to build, maintained for a millennium by a dynasty that should have lacked the resources to sustain it, abandoned when that dynasty fell and never occupied again. The construction alone argues for knowledge we have not credited to Pacific Islanders: logistics, engineering, organisational capacity on a scale reserved in our histories for continental civilizations. The purpose argues for something deeper, something spiritual, something we can sense in the arrangement of the stones but cannot articulate. The questions that began at Göbekli Tepe echo here at the edge of the world's largest ocean. How? Why? Who taught them? Where did that knowledge go? And what happens when the answer to those questions lies not across water, but beneath the earth itself? When an entire civilization chose to carve its refuge not outward into the world, but downward into darkness? The journey from the Pacific Reef to the high Anatolian plateau spans continents, cultures, millennia. Yet the thread connecting them pulls tighter with each site we encounter. At Göbekli Tepe, we found temples older than agriculture. At Puma Punku, we found precision older than the tools that supposedly created it. At Nan Madol, we found engineering older than the organisational capacity that should have been required. Now, beneath the sun-baked farmland of central Turkey, we find something that inverts every assumption about ancient construction. We find a city built not upward toward the sky, but downward into the stone itself. We find Derinkuyu. The Cappadocian Plateau rises from the heart of Anatolia like a rumpled blanket of volcanic ash turned to stone. Millions of years ago, eruptions from nearby mountains blanketed this region in layers of pyroclastic material that compressed over geological time into tuff, a soft, porous rock that hardens when exposed to air. Wind and water sculpted the landscape into a surreal terrain of cones, columns, and cave-studded cliffs that have drawn human settlement for at least 10,000 years. The rock invites habitation. It can be carved with simple tools when freshly exposed, then firms into durable walls within weeks. It maintains relatively stable temperatures year-round, cool in the brutal summers, warm in the freezing winters. It provides natural shelter from the elements and from enemies. Humans have been digging into this rock since before recorded history. But no one knew how deep that digging went until 1963. The details of the discovery have become legend in the region. A Turkish man. His name varies in different accounts, lost to the informal archaeology of local memory, was renovating his home in the small town of Derinkuyu, a farming community unremarkable in every visible respect. He broke through a wall in his basement, expecting perhaps to find a small storage chamber, a root cellar, one of the countless small caves that honeycomb the Cappadocian rock. Instead, his tools broke through into darkness. Cool air rushed up from below, carrying the smell of ancient stone. He had discovered a room. Beyond the room lay a passageway. Beyond the passageway lay more rooms, more passages, a branching network that descended into the earth far beyond the reach of his flashlight. What he had found was an underground city of almost inconceivable scale. Derinkuyu. The name means deep well in Turkish, though the true depths of the irony would not become clear for years, extends 18 stories beneath the surface of the plateau. 280 feet approximately of continuous habitable space carved entirely from the surrounding volcanic tuff. Not a natural cave system expanded by human effort. Not a mine converted to shelter. A city, designed and excavated as a city, with all the infrastructure that designation implies. Researchers have mapped over 600 entrances to the complex, scattered across the surface of the town, hidden in homes and courtyards beneath churches, through wells that seem to serve no purpose beyond drawing water. The entrances feed into a network of corridors, chambers, and vertical shafts that could accommodate an estimated 20,000 people, along with their livestock, their food stores, their water supplies, their means of survival for extended periods, not days, months, perhaps longer. The sophistication of the design challenges everything we think we understand about ancient underground construction. Air circulation through such a complex presents immediate engineering problems. Without adequate ventilation, the carbon dioxide exhaled by thousands of occupants and their animals would accumulate in the lower levels, creating a death trap. The builders of Derinkuyu solved this through a system of vertical shafts, some of which reach from the lowest levels all the way to the surface, nearly 300 feet of continuous excavation through solid rock, maintaining a consistent diameter throughout their length. These shafts created natural convection currents. Warm, stale air rose through the channels, drawing fresh air down through the corridors and entrances, circulating oxygen throughout the entire complex. The engineering is passive. No fans, no mechanical systems, nothing that could fail, just physics, understood and applied with remarkable precision. Water presented different challenges. Underground aquifers thread through the Cappadocian rock, but accessing them reliably while preventing contamination required careful planning. The builders excavated deep wells that tapped into these aquifers, providing fresh water on multiple levels of the complex. Some of these wells extend to remarkable depths, and researchers have noted that they were positioned not only for water access, but also to prevent poisoning. If an invading army discovered an entrance and attempted to contaminate the water supply, the well structure would limit the spread of toxins to only a portion of the system. The defensive thinking is layered, redundant, anticipating threats, and countering them through architecture alone. And the defences themselves are astonishing. Massive circular stone doors, some weighing nearly 1,000 pounds, could be rolled across corridor entrances from the inside only. These doors, carved from the same volcanic tuff but hardened through centuries of air exposure, feature small holes in their centres, not for ventilation, but for spears. Defenders could thrust weapons through these apertures at attackers, trapped in the narrow corridors while the attackers had no leverage, no angle, no way to move the door from their side. The corridors themselves were designed for defence. Low ceilings that forced invaders to crouch, narrow passages that prevented the use of superior numbers, sharp turns that eliminated lines of sight and negated the advantage of ranged weapons. An army could pound against the stone doors for weeks without breaking through. Meanwhile, the inhabitants could survive indefinitely on stored food, fresh water, and the steady circulation of air. This was not improvised shelter. This was not a refuge carved in panic as enemies approached. This was the product of long-term planning, systematic execution, and sophisticated understanding of engineering, hydrology, defense, and human survival needs. The layout reveals the complexity of what functioned as a complete underground society. Residential chambers cluster on different levels, connected by stairs and ramps that spiral downward into the rock. Communal kitchens feature blackened ceilings from centuries of cooking fires, The smoke vented through dedicated channels that prevented the air from becoming unbreathable. Storage rooms held grain, oil, wine, provisions for extended occupation. Stables accommodated livestock on the upper levels, where the animals' waste could be managed, and their presence would not foul the deeper chambers. Schools, according to local tradition, occupied certain rooms. Churches, complete with carved altars and niches for icons, served the spiritual needs of the population. Wineries allowed the pressing and fermentation of grapes underground, the cool constant temperature ideal for the process. The dead were buried in dedicated chambers, separated from the living quarters by distance and by carefully designed airflow that prevented the smell of decay from reaching the inhabited areas. Researchers have even identified what appear to be communication tunnels connecting Derinkuyu to other underground cities in the region, a network of subterranean settlements that may have allowed tens of thousands of people to move between refuges without ever surfacing. The questions that rise from this darkness are as layered as the city itself. When was it built? The conventional dating places initial construction during the Phrygian period, around the 8th century BCE, with significant expansion during the Byzantine era when Christian populations used the underground cities to shelter from Arab raids. This timeline is plausible. The Phrygians were sophisticated builders, and the Byzantine expansion is well documented in historical records. Yet certain aspects of the construction challenge this chronology. The deepest levels, some researchers argue, show evidence of more primitive tool marks, as if the original excavation predates the Phrygian refinements above. The scale of the deepest chambers suggests a different purpose than the clearly Byzantine churches of the upper levels. Some scholars have proposed that the underground city was not created by any single civilization, but rather discovered, expanded and modified by successive cultures over thousands of years. If this hypothesis is correct, the original builders remain unknown, their timeline uncertain, their identity lost to the darkness they carved. Who built it? The Phrygians left no written records explaining the construction. The Hittites, who preceded them in the region, left extensive archives, but no mention of underground cities on this scale. The Byzantine Christians, who certainly used and expanded the complex, treated it as inherited infrastructure, shelter that already existed when they needed it. The local population today preserves traditions about the underground cities, but these traditions focus on how the caves were used rather than how they were created. The origin recedes with each question, dissolving into the murk of prehistory. And the most haunting question of all, why? Why would any civilization invest the staggering labour required to carve an 18-story city from solid rock? The excavation alone defies casual explanation. Removing the volcanic tuff, even relatively soft stone, requires continuous effort. Chipping, hauling, disposing of debris, supporting the ceilings as chambers expand, managing groundwater, maintaining the tools. The volume of stone removed from Derinkuyu exceeds comprehension. Researchers have estimated millions of cubic feet of rock, carried out through those 600 entrances, deposited somewhere on the surface in quantities that should form visible hills, but somehow do not. Where did the stone go? How long did the excavation take? How many generations lived and died with stone dust in their lungs, carving deeper into the earth? The conventional answer is persecution. Christians fleeing Roman authorities, then Arab raiders, then waves of invasion that washed across Anatolia for centuries. The underground cities offered protection that surface settlements could not provide. Hide the entrances, seal the doors, wait in darkness until the danger passed. This explanation is reasonable. It accounts for the defensive architecture, the self-contained infrastructure, the scale of the refuge. Religious minorities have always sought safety in hidden places, but the scale still troubles the careful observer. 20,000 people can survive for months underground. That is not hiding from a raiding party. That is not waiting out a siege of weeks. That is preparing for catastrophic, long-duration threats that make the surface uninhabitable. What kind of persecution requires subterranean cities connected by tunnels, supplied with water, ventilated by engineering, stocked with food for extended duration? What drove an entire civilization to conclude that their best hope for survival lay not in walls, not in fortifications, not in alliances or flight, but in disappearing completely into the earth? The Hopi people of the American Southwest preserved traditions of their ancestors emerging from underground after a previous world was destroyed. The Cherokee speak of caves that sheltered the survivors of ancient catastrophes. Tibetan legends describe hidden kingdoms beneath the mountains where advanced civilizations waited out apocalyptic events. Across cultures, across continents, the same motif recurs. When disaster strikes, seek safety below. The builders of Derinkuyu may have been acting on knowledge we have lost, preparing for threats we no longer remember. The underground city is not unique to Derinkuyu. The Cappadocian Plateau is honeycombed with subterranean settlements. Keimakli, Ozkonak, Mazi, dozens of smaller complexes. Together they could have sheltered over 100,000 people, an entire regional population vanishing beneath the earth at need. The coordination implied by this network is staggering. Different cities connected by tunnels, different complexes serving different functions, a subterranean infrastructure of civilization operating in parallel to the surface settlements, ready to activate when the sky became unsafe. We can walk those corridors today. Tourists descend the worn stairs, duck through the low passageways, photograph the massive stone doors and the blackened kitchen ceilings, and the carved niches that held oil lamps. The air is cool and slightly damp. The silence presses against the ears. And somewhere in the lower levels, sections remain unexplored. Chambers that collapsed long ago. Tunnels that lead into darkness beyond the reach of archaeological survey. Derinkuyu has revealed much, but it has not revealed everything. The stone keeps its own counsel. Standing in those deep chambers, surrounded by walls carved by hands that left no names, one cannot escape the feeling that something essential has been lost. Not just the techniques of excavation, not just the organization required to coordinate such massive labor, but the memory of why. The builders of Derinkuyu were afraid of something. They were afraid enough to carve a city from solid rock, to prepare refuge for tens of thousands, to design defenses against threats from above. Whatever they feared has been forgotten. But the city remains, silent testament to a terror so profound it reshaped the landscape itself. The pattern that began at Göbekli Tepe continues to assert itself. Deliberate construction on a scale that challenges our assumptions. Sophisticated engineering without the tools we believe necessary. And at the end, intentional concealment. Temples buried under artificial hills, cities hidden beneath the earth, knowledge vanishing as if it were never meant to survive. From the depths of Anatolia, the trail leads higher still, across the Pacific, across the Atlantic to the roof of South America, where the Andes thrust nearly 13,000 feet toward the sky. Here, at an elevation where most people gasp for breath, another impossibility waits in the thin air. Here, scattered across a windswept plateau, lie the ruins of Pumapunku. The Bolivian Altiplano stretches across the high Andes like a frozen sea of brown and gold. The air is thin at this elevation, the sunlight fierce, the nights bitterly cold. This is not gentle country. The soil is poor, the growing season short, the weather brutal and unpredictable. Human settlement here has always been a negotiation with extremity, a constant struggle against an environment that seems designed to discourage habitation. Yet humans have lived on the Altiplano for at least 15,000 years, adapting to the altitude, developing the crops and techniques necessary to extract sustenance from this demanding land. The Tiwanaku civilization emerged here around 300 CE, building a capital city on the shores of Lake Titicaca that at its height may have housed 40,000 people. Their influence spread across hundreds of miles, their trade networks reaching both coasts of South America, their religious and political authority shaping the Andean world for nearly 1,000 years. And at the edge of their capital, they built something that does not fit. Pumapunku lies about a mile from the main ceremonial centre of Tiwanaku, separated from the temples and pyramids that drew pilgrims from across the empire. Unlike those structures, which follow patterns recognizable from other Andean sites, Pumapunku appears almost alien in its design. The site today is a field of scattered megaliths, massive blocks of red sandstone and grey andesite tumbled across the landscape as if shaken by a giant's hand. Earthquakes, treasure hunters, colonial-era quarrying for building materials. The centuries have not been kind to this place. What remains is fragmentary, confusing, suggestive of grandeur but resistant to reconstruction. Yet even in its ruined state, Pumapunku presents anomalies that demand attention. The precision of the stonework exceeds anything else in the pre-Columbian Americas. Flat surfaces so level that water pooled on them finds no place to flow. Right angles so exact that modern laser measurements confirm tolerances within fractions of a degree. HE-shaped blocks carved with interlocking features that fit together like pieces from a puzzle box, their male and female joints achieving fits so tight that no mortar was needed or used. The stones were not carved from soft limestone or sandite, materials that yield relatively easily to copper and bronze. They were carved from andesite, a volcanic rock so hard that only diamond or tungsten exceeds its resistance to cutting. The Tiwanaku had neither metal. They had stone tools and copper alloys too soft to scratch andesite and patience, and whatever knowledge they brought to bear on this material. The blocks themselves present the first mystery. Some of the sandstone megaliths weigh over 130 tons, the mass of a blue whale concentrated in a single piece of quarried stone. The andesite blocks are smaller but denser, some weighing over 40 tons. The quarries have been identified. The sandstone came from a site approximately 10 miles distant, the andesite from the shores of Lake Titicaca over 50 miles away. Between the quarries and Pumapunku lies some of the most challenging terrain on Earth: steep ravines, river crossings, elevations that leave sea-level visitors dizzy and weak. The Tiwanaku had no wheels. They had no draft animals capable of hauling such loads. They had human labour and ropes woven from plant fibres, and whatever techniques they developed for moving objects that should have been unmovable. Experimental archaeologists have attempted to replicate the transportation methods. The results are not encouraging. Dragging even smaller stones across flat ground requires enormous teams working in careful coordination. Dragging multi-ton blocks uphill across broken terrain at altitudes where oxygen deprivation saps strength and judgment moves from difficult to functionally impossible. The estimates for labour required stretch into the absurd. Thousands of workers for months to move a single stone, repeated hundreds of times. The population of Tiwanaku, even at its height, could not have sustained such an effort while also farming, trading, building, and performing the other functions of a complex society. But the transportation is only the beginning of the mystery. The precision cuts present challenges that go beyond moving material. The H-shaped blocks that have become iconic images of Pumapunku feature eye-shaped channels cut into their surfaces with mechanical regularity. The channels are exactly the right dimensions to accept metal clamps, copper arsenic bronze tie pieces that held the blocks together in their original configuration. The craftsmanship required for this joinery is extraordinary. Each channel must match its corresponding channel in the adjacent block with tolerances measured in millimetres, or the clamps will not seat properly and the join will fail. How do you achieve millimetre precision when cutting volcanic rock with stone tools? The mainstream archaeological explanation invokes patience, skill, and abundant labour. The Tiwanaku were master stoneworkers who developed techniques over generations, passing down specialised knowledge through apprenticeship and tradition. They used stone hammers and abrasive sand, grinding away the andesite grain by grain until the desired shape emerged. The process was slow but not impossible. Human hands, given enough time, can achieve remarkable precision. This explanation is reasonable. It is consistent with the evidence of tool marks found on some blocks. It acknowledges the capabilities of ancient peoples without invoking external intervention. Yet certain aspects continue to invite deeper reflection. The drill holes. Scattered across several blocks at Pumapunku are small, circular holes of extraordinary regularity. They are not rough divots made by repeated hammer strikes. They are smooth-sided cylinders, their diameters consistent, their depths uniform. The spacing between them on several blocks shows mathematical relationships, equidistant intervals that suggest measurement, planning, templates. Some researchers have interpreted these holes as evidence of metal clamps, places where pins or dowels secured adjoining stones. Others have noted that the holes appear decorative, arranged in patterns that served aesthetic rather than structural purposes. But the drilling itself remains unexplained. Creating smooth cylindrical holes in andesite using the tools available to the Tiwanaku should have been extraordinarily difficult. Re-drills with abrasive sand can penetrate stone, but they leave characteristic irregularities, slight wobble marks, variations in diameter, rough flaws. The holes at Pumapunku are too regular, too consistent, too clean. Modern diamond-tipped core drills produce similar results. Nothing in the Tiwanaku toolkit should have achieved this level of precision. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in recent years have revealed another layer of complexity. Beneath the scattered surface stones lies an extensive network of underground chambers, channels, and waterways. The Tiwanaku engineers built not only upward but downward, creating a hydraulic infrastructure that may have controlled water flow across the site, directed drainage, perhaps even used water for construction purposes themselves. Some researchers have speculated about water-powered machinery, though no evidence of such devices has been recovered. Others suggest the underground channels served ritual purposes, the flow of water through carefully designed conduits creating sounds, movements, or symbolic meanings lost to us. The integration of surface architecture with subterranean engineering suggests a sophistication that continues to surprise scholars, accustomed to viewing the Tiwanaku as a relatively minor pre-Columbian culture. And then there is the question of destruction. Pumapunku is ruined, but the nature of the ruin is peculiar. Earthquakes have struck the Altiplano throughout recorded history, toppling buildings, cracking walls, scattering loose stones. But the massive blocks at Pumapunku have not merely fallen. They have been displaced, moved from their original positions, scattered across the site in patterns that suggest more than seismic activity. Some researchers have proposed that the site was deliberately dismantled at some point in its history, the stones removed for reuse elsewhere. The original structure cannibalized by later builders who lacked the skill to create such work, but recognized its value as building material. This hypothesis would explain the fragmentary state of the ruins, the absence of reconstruction attempts, the sense that Pumapunku was abandoned and stripped rather than simply fallen. Others have noted the consistency of the destruction with impact events, the scattering patterns, the burial under sediment, the orientation of fallen blocks. These researchers, working on the fringes of mainstream acceptance, have proposed that Pumapunku was destroyed by a catastrophic event, perhaps the same event that ended the Younger Dryas period around 10 to 800 BCE, when comet fragments may have struck the Earth and triggered global climate disruption. If this hypothesis is correct, Pumapunku is not centuries old but millennia, a survivor from a previous age of civilization, built by peoples who vanished in the catastrophe, their knowledge and their works buried under the debris of cosmic impact. This hypothesis remains controversial. The mainstream dating of Pumapunku places initial construction around 536 CE, based on radiocarbon analysis of organic material found at the site. But organic material can contaminate, can migrate through soil layers, can provide dates for later activity rather than original construction. The stones themselves cannot be dated. The precision cuts, the impossible transportation, the underground hydraulic systems, these argue for capabilities that seem out of place in a 6th century Andean context, but might make more sense in a deeper, more sophisticated past. We cannot know. The evidence is fragmentary, the interpretations contested, the truth buried under centuries of destruction and neglect. What remains is stone, and the questions the stone provokes. How did they cut it? How did they move it? Why did they build it? And what happened to the knowledge that made it possible? The wind sweeps across the Altiplano, carrying the thin, cold air of 13,000 feet, stirring the brown grasses that have grown up between the scattered megaliths. Tourists photograph the H-blocks, the drill holes, the perfectly flat surfaces. Guides recite the conventional explanations, and the visitors nod, and life continues on the surface of things. But beneath that surface, in the underground channels, in the displaced foundations, in the scattered remnants of something that should not have been possible, the mystery persists. The same mystery that emerged from the buried temples of Göbekli Tepe. The same mystery that rises from the basalt pillars of Nanmadol. The same mystery that waits in the darkness of Derinkuyu. Across continents, across millennia, across cultures that should have had no contact with one another, the pattern repeats. Sophisticated construction without adequate tools, massive labour without adequate population. Knowledge that appears, flourishes and vanishes without explanation. From the windswept heights of the Bolivian Altiplano, our exploration now descends. Not across oceans or continents this time, but downward, into the earth itself, into a darkness carved by human hands for purposes that remain profoundly unclear. The transition feels appropriate. From the exposed megaliths of Pumapunku scattered under an infinite sky, to a place where sky does not exist, where sunlight has never penetrated, where an entire civilization chose to build not upward toward the heavens, but downward into the bedrock, as if fleeing something, or hiding something, or perhaps both. The journey takes us to central Turkey, to the Cappadocia region, where the landscape itself seems to belong to another world. Volcanic eruptions millions of years ago deposited thick layers of ash across the plateau, and time compressed that ash into soft stone called tuff, easily carved but surprisingly durable once exposed to air. Erosion sculpted this tuff into surreal formations, towers, cones, pillars, and ridges that rise from the valleys like the ruins of some alien architecture. The locals call them fairy chimneys, and visitors photograph them by the thousands, marvelling at nature's strange artistry. But the true wonder of Cappadocia lies not in what rises above the ground. It lies in what was carved beneath it. Derinkuyu does not announce itself. The town that bears the same name is unremarkable, a small settlement of modest houses and quiet streets in the Nevşehir province, roughly 300 kilometers southeast of Ankara. Nothing in the town's appearance suggests what lies beneath. There are no towering monuments, no massive stone walls, no visible evidence of the extraordinary engineering that honeycombs the bedrock below. The entrance, when you find it, is disappointingly ordinary. A doorway that could lead to any basement, any cellar, any underground storage space. The descent that follows is anything but ordinary. The story of Derinkuyu's modern discovery has the quality of myth, though it happened within living memory. In 1963, a resident of the town was renovating his home, knocking down a wall in his basement to expand his storage space. Behind the wall, he found not earth or solid rock, but an opening, a passageway that led into darkness. He followed it, and the darkness continued. Rooms opened into corridors, corridors branched into chambers, chambers connected to shafts that plunged deeper into the earth. The man had accidentally uncovered what would prove to be the largest excavated underground city in the world. The scale defies casual comprehension. Derinkuyu extends at least 18 stories below ground level, reaching depths of approximately 85 meters, nearly 280 feet straight down into the earth. The excavated area encompasses roughly 400,000 square feet, though ground-penetrating surveys suggest that significant portions remain unexplored, sealed behind collapsed passages or deliberately blocked tunnels. At full capacity, the city could shelter an estimated 20,000 people, along with their livestock, their food stores, their tools, and everything necessary to sustain life for extended periods. This was not a temporary hiding place. This was a complete underground civilization, carved entirely by hand from solid rock. The engineering required to achieve this is staggering in its complexity. Consider first the basic challenge of excavation. The tuff of Cappadocia is relatively soft when first exposed, soft enough to carve with simple stone or bronze tools. But it hardens significantly upon contact with air, a chemical process that transforms the carved surfaces into durable stone within days of exposure. The builders of Derinkuyu understood this property and used it to their advantage, carving chambers and passages that would strengthen themselves over time, creating a structure that has endured for millennia without significant collapse. But understanding a property and exploiting it across 400,000 square feet of excavation, across 18 vertical stories, across a three-dimensional labyrinth of interconnected spaces, this requires planning, coordination, and architectural knowledge that seems incompatible with the supposed primitiveness of ancient peoples. The ventilation alone would challenge modern engineers attempting the same project. Air does not naturally circulate in underground spaces. Without ventilation, the carbon dioxide exhaled by 20,000 people, and their animals would accumulate at lower levels, the oxygen would deplete, and the inhabitants would suffocate within hours. Derinkuyu's builders solved this problem with a sophisticated system of ventilation shafts. Over 50 have been identified, boring straight down through the rock, some reaching depths of 60 meters or more. These shafts do not simply connect to the surface. They are strategically positioned to create airflow patterns, the differences in temperature between deep underground and surface level generating convection currents that continuously circulate fresh air throughout the complex. The physics involved are not simple. The calculations required to determine shaft diameter, depth, and placement for optimal airflow across such a massive underground space suggest an understanding of fluid dynamics and thermodynamics that we do not typically associate with ancient builders. Then there are the wells. At least 15 shafts served as water wells, reaching down to the water table and providing fresh water to the underground population. The engineering challenge here was not merely reaching the water, but preventing contamination, ensuring that waste from the levels above did not seep into the water supply below. The builders achieved this through careful placement, separate drainage systems, and what appears to be an understanding of groundwater movement that allowed them to tap clean aquifers while isolating potential sources of pollution. These were not lucky accidents. These were deliberate engineering solutions to complex problems implemented consistently across a massive construction project. The architecture of the living spaces themselves reveals a sophisticated understanding of human needs in confined environments. The city is organized into distinct zones: residential areas with small family chambers, communal spaces for cooking and eating, storage rooms for food and supplies, stables for animals on the upper levels where ventilation was strongest, religious spaces including churches and chapels on deeper levels where acoustics created resonant, contemplative atmospheres. Schools have been identified, meeting halls, spaces that appear to have served as kitchens with blackened ceilings from cooking fires, and channels carved to direct smoke toward ventilation shafts. Wineries complete with grape presses and fermentation vats suggest that the inhabitants intended to remain underground long enough to produce their own wine from stored grapes. This was not a refuge for days or weeks. This was infrastructure for months, perhaps years of subterranean life. The defensive features are perhaps the most haunting aspect of Derinkuyu's design. Throughout the complex, at strategic points along the passages and between levels, the builders installed massive circular stone doors, enormous wheels of rock weighing hundreds of kilograms each, fitted precisely into carved grooves. These doors could only be operated from the inside. When rolled into position, they sealed the passages completely, creating barriers that no attacking force could breach without demolishing the surrounding rock. The doors were not defensive afterthoughts. They were integrated into the original design, the grooves and recesses carved during initial excavation, the doors themselves shaped to match their housings with precision that speaks to careful planning rather than improvised adaptation. What were they hiding from? The question haunts every visitor who descends those carved stairs, passes through those narrow corridors, stands in those chambers lit only by electric lights installed for tourism. The scale of the construction, the sophistication of the engineering, the completeness of the infrastructure for long-term underground survival, all of this speaks to a profound and sustained fear. You do not carve 20,000 cubic meters of rock from the earth. You do not create a city for 20,000 souls in permanent darkness unless you are absolutely certain that the surface is, or will become, uninhabitable. The conventional explanations offer partial answers. Early Christians, fleeing persecution by Roman authorities, are frequently cited as the builders, or at least the primary inhabitants of Derinkuyu. The churches and chapels found throughout the complex support this interpretation, as do the historical records of Christian communities in Cappadocia during the Byzantine period. The 7th and 8th centuries saw Arab invasions sweep across Anatolia, and the underground cities would have provided ideal refuge from raiding parties that lacked the time or resources to mount prolonged sieges. This narrative places Derinkuyu comfortably within the familiar framework of historical persecution and survival, religious minorities carving out spaces of safety beneath the earth. Yet certain details resist this comfortable framing. The scale of Derinkuyu far exceeds what would be necessary for hiding from occasional raids. Carving a city for 20,000 people is not the work of decades. It is the work of centuries, of continuous organized effort sustained across multiple generations. The sophistication of the ventilation and water systems suggests not a gradual accumulation of ad hoc improvements, but a coherent original design, implemented with knowledge of the final intended scale. And perhaps most troubling, Derinkuyu is not unique. It is merely the largest discovered example of a phenomenon that spans the entire Cappadocian region. Surveys have identified over 200 underground structures in the area, ranging from simple caves and cellars to complex multi-level cities. Kaymakli, connected to Derinkuyu by a tunnel stretching nearly 8 kilometers, reaches 8 stories in depth. Özkonak, discovered in 1972, extends 10 levels down and features communication systems. Speaking tubes carved through the rock to allow warnings and instructions to pass between levels. Marzi, Tatlarin, Assigirl. The list continues. each site adding to a picture of underground construction so extensive that the entire region seems to float above a hidden world. Who coordinated this effort? What central authority commanded the resources and labour to carve not one but hundreds of underground refugees across a geographic area spanning hundreds of square kilometres? The dating of these structures presents significant challenges. The rock itself cannot be dated. Pottery, artefacts and organic material found within the complexes provide dates for occupation, not construction. The earliest confirmed occupation of Derinkuyu extends to the Phrygian period, around the 8th century BCE, based on artefacts recovered from the upper levels. But occupation and construction are not the same thing. A structure can be built, abandoned, and reoccupied centuries or millennia later, with the later occupants leaving the artefacts that archaeologists eventually date. The 8th century Phrygians may have been inhabitants of Derinkuyu. They may not have been its builders. Some researchers have pushed the timeline backward, noting that the Hittites, who dominated Anatolia during the 2nd millennium BCE, are mentioned in ancient texts as having used underground shelters and may have initiated construction at some Cappadocian sites. This would place initial carving roughly 3,000 years ago, a significant extension beyond the Phrygian dating. But even this extended timeline leaves questions unanswered. The Hittites were a sophisticated Bronze Age civilization, capable of impressive construction, but the engineering of Derinkuyu, the ventilation calculations, the hydraulic planning, the defensive integration, seems to exceed typical Hittite capabilities as we understand them. And the local oral traditions push the timeline further still, speaking of the underground cities as ancient beyond memory, built by peoples whose names and natures have been forgotten. Standing in the deepest accessible level of Derinkuyu, roughly 80 meters below the Turkish sunlight, one becomes aware of silence in a way that surface dwellers rarely experience. This is not the silence of a quiet room or an empty field. This is absolute silence, the silence of solid rock pressing in from all directions, absorbing every vibration, swallowing every echo before it can form. The air is cool and still, untouched by weather, unchanged by seasons. Time feels different here. The urgency of the surface world, the cycles of day and night, the passing of years, the pressure of mortality, all of this recedes in the unchanging darkness. One can understand in such a place how an entire population might choose to remain underground, might adapt to the darkness, might forget the world above. But understanding the appeal of refuge does not explain the origin of the fear that drove such refuge. What threatened early Cappadocians so severely that carving entire cities from bedrock seemed a reasonable response? Raiders and invaders could be resisted, bribed, outlasted. Persecution could be fled. Natural disasters, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, floods, would not be escaped by going underground. What manner of threat requires shelter capable of sustaining tens of thousands of people for months at a time, shelter sealed by massive stone doors that only open from inside, shelter designed not just to hide but to survive? The question finds no definitive answer in the archaeological record. What the record does provide is evidence of occupations spanning thousands of years: Phrygians, Persians, Christians, Byzantine monks, Ottoman refugees, wave after wave of inhabitants using the underground cities for purposes that shifted with the changing threats of each era. The persistence of this use across cultures and centuries suggests that the value of such refugees was repeatedly demonstrated, that whatever fears inspired the original construction were fears that recurred, that the darkness below remained preferable to certain conditions above. There is another element to Derinkuyu that receives less attention in the tourist literature, an element that some researchers find more disturbing than the scale or sophistication of the construction. The lower levels of the complex, below the churches, below the communal spaces, below the stables and storage rooms, contain chambers whose purpose remains unclear. These spaces are not living quarters, they are not storage, they are not defensive positions. They are simply rooms, carved with the same care as the rest of the complex, connected to the ventilation systems, equipped with niches and recesses whose functions are unknown. Some researchers have identified these spaces as prisons or isolation chambers, places where individuals could be confined away from the main population. Others have suggested ritual purposes, spaces for ceremonies, initiations, or practices that required removal from ordinary life. The darkness of the deepest levels would be complete without artificial light, the silence absolute, the separation from the surface world total. Whatever occurred in these chambers occurred in conditions that few modern people can truly imagine, conditions of sensory deprivation, of isolation from everything familiar, of existence reduced to its most fundamental elements. Local traditions speak of passages that extend beyond the explored areas, of tunnels that connect to other underground cities, of chambers that have never been opened, of secrets buried deeper still. Residents of Derinkuyu and the surrounding villages report sounds in the night, not from above but from below, as if movement continues in the unexplored depths, as if activity persists in chambers that have not seen light in millennia. These reports are dismissed by authorities as imagination, as the settling of rock, as the movement of air through the ventilation shafts. The reports persist nonetheless. The explored portions of Derinkuyu represent, according to some estimates, perhaps only 10 to 15% of the total underground complex. Ground-penetrating radar and other survey technologies have revealed extensive void spaces beneath and beyond the accessible areas, spaces that have never been entered by modern researchers. Collapsed passages, deliberate blockages, and the sheer difficulty of excavating additional chambers have limited exploration to date. What might lie in the unexcavated 85%? More living quarters? Additional defensive positions? Or something else entirely, something that might explain both the extraordinary effort of construction and the persistent unease that locals report when speaking of the deepest levels? The answers, if they exist, remain buried. The rock keeps its secrets as effectively as it kept its ancient inhabitants safe. Visitors descend the carved stairs, follow the guided paths, photograph the massive rolling doors and the blackened kitchen ceilings, marvel appropriately at the scale of ancient achievement, and return to the surface, to the sunlight, to the fairy chimneys and the tourist shops and the reassuring ordinariness of modern life. The depths close behind them, and the silence returns, and whatever waits in the unexplored chambers continues to wait, patient as the stone that surrounds it. From this underground world, from the depths beneath Turkish villages, our attention shifts now across vast distances of open water to a place where the mystery takes a different form but asks similar questions. The Pacific Ocean stretches for thousands of kilometers in every direction, the largest feature on Earth's surface, dotted with islands so small and so remote that their existence seems almost accidental. It is on one of these islands, in one of the most isolated locations on the planet, that we find perhaps the strangest of all the structures that challenge our understanding of ancient capability. Pohnpei rises from the western Pacific roughly 2,000 kilometers north of the equator, a volcanic island in the Caroline archipelago of Micronesia. The island is lush, tropical, draped in rainforest and circled by a barrier reef that encloses a lagoon of remarkable clarity. By modern standards, Pohnpei is remote. The nearest major landmass, New Guinea, lies over 2,000 kilometers to the southwest, and most visitors arrive by small aircraft from Guam, itself a distant outpost in the Pacific vastness. But even by the standards of Pacific isolation, the location of what awaits off Pohnpei's southeastern coast seems impossible. Nan Madol emerges from the waters of the lagoon like a fever dream, like something that has no right to exist where it exists. 92 artificial islets spread across roughly 200 acres of tidal flats and reef, constructed not from coral or sand, but from massive columns of crystalline basalt, stacked like logs in a cabin, rising from the water in walls that reach heights of 8 meters and more. The scale defies immediate comprehension. Standing on the reef at low tide, watching the dark basalt walls rise from the shallows, the mind struggles to accept what the eyes report. This is not a few scattered ruins. This is not a modest settlement adapted to local conditions. This is an artificial city built on top of the ocean, constructed from materials that do not occur naturally in this location, assembled according to principles that remain unexplained and abandoned under circumstances that have never been satisfactorily determined. The basalt columns that form the walls of Nan Madol are prismatic, hexagonal, and pentagonal in cross-section, created by the slow cooling of volcanic lava in conditions that produce natural geometric regularity. Such columns occur in volcanic regions worldwide: the Giant's Causeway in Ireland, the Devil's Postpile in California, the basalt formations of Iceland. But the columns at Nan Madol did not simply occur here. They were quarried from volcanic outcrops on the opposite side of Pohnpei, from locations separated from the construction site by 25 miles of dense rainforest, steep volcanic terrain, and open water. The logistics alone beg a belief. Individual columns weigh up to 50 tons. The total quantity of basalt moved to construct Nan Madol has been estimated at approximately 750,000 metric tons. This material had to be extracted from volcanic rock, transported across an island with no roads and no wheeled vehicles, loaded onto watercraft of some kind, ferried across open water, and then stacked with sufficient precision to create walls that have stood for centuries in one of the most corrosive environments on Earth. How? The question echoes across the empty islets, unanswered. Modern engineering offers theoretical possibilities: log rollers, ramps, rafts, human muscle coordinated through extraordinary organization. But theoretical possibilities and practical demonstrations are not the same thing. No experimental archaeology project has successfully replicated the transport of 50-ton basalt columns across the terrain and water that separates the quarry sites from Nan Madol. No tools have been found that would explain how the columns were extracted and shaped. No construction materials, ropes, timbers, rafts have survived in the archaeological record. The stones simply exist where they exist, arranged in patterns that speak of deliberate design, serving purposes that remain debated, created by methods that have vanished from human memory. The construction technique itself presents anomalies that compound the transport mystery. The basalt columns were not mortared or cemented. They were stacked in a header and stretcher pattern, alternating horizontal and perpendicular orientations to create interlocking stability, the same principle used in modern log cabin construction. But log cabins are built from wood, from materials that can be shaped and adjusted with hand tools, from elements light enough for small teams to manipulate. The builders of Nan Madol applied this technique to crystalline volcanic rock weighing many tons per piece. How did they position stones of such mass with sufficient precision to achieve the interlocking stability the walls demonstrate? How did they lift columns to heights of 8 meters and more without cranes, without pulleys of sufficient capacity, without the mechanical advantage that modern construction takes for granted? How did they accomplish any of this on a foundation of coral reef and tidal flat, in an environment where the substrate itself is unstable, where high tides submerge the construction zone twice daily, where tropical storms sweep across the lagoon with devastating regularity? The answers that archaeology provides are frustratingly incomplete. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials found at the site suggests that construction began around the 8th or 9th century of the Common Era and continued for approximately 400 years. The builders belonged to the Sodelur dynasty, a ruling lineage that dominated Pohnpei for roughly a millennium before being overthrown in the 17th century. The purpose of Nan Madol appears to have been primarily ceremonial and political, a seat of power for the Sodelur chiefs, a ritual centre where religious observances were conducted, a necropolis where rulers were interred. Some islets served specific functions. Nandowas contained the royal mortuary, where the bodies of Sodelur chiefs were prepared and entombed. Madolpao served as the residence of the high priest. Peikap may have functioned as a coconut oil preparation facility. The functional assignments are reasonable. They explain nothing about the construction itself. The Sodelur population at any given time has been estimated at roughly 25,000 people across all of Pohnpei. This is not an insignificant number, but neither is it the labour force of Egypt or the organised millions of imperial China. 25,000 people, working with no metal tools, no wheels, no draft animals, no written language to coordinate complex logistics, somehow quarried, transported and assembled 750,000 metric tons of basalt into 92 artificial islands. The labour estimates that archaeologists have calculated suggest that with known ancient methods, construction would have required continuous work over a period exceeding 1,000 years, far longer than the Sodelur dynasty itself existed. Either the population was larger than estimated, the methods were more efficient than understood, the construction period was longer than radiocarbon dating indicates, or something fundamental about the explanation is missing. The builders themselves offered no written testimony, no construction records, no technical manuals. They left behind only the stones and the silence. Local oral traditions provide an alternative explanation that modern researchers dismiss as myth, but that the people of Pohnpei continue to repeat to this day. According to legend, Nan Madol was constructed by two brothers, Olisipa and Olosopa, twin sorcerers who arrived from a distant land to the west. The brothers possessed magical powers that allowed them to make the massive basalt columns fly through the air. The stones floated across the lagoon, settled into their appointed positions, and stacked themselves according to the brothers' commands. The city rose effortlessly, constructed not by human labour, but by supernatural intervention. When the work was complete, the brothers established the Sodalur dynasty and ruled from their impossible city until the line eventually fell. The story is mythology. It cannot be accepted as historical fact, yet it persists across generations, repeated by descendants of the people who actually lived at Nan Madol, transmitted through oral tradition by communities that have no reason to invent explanations for construction they could have witnessed. Why does the memory of floating stones survive when practical construction knowledge has been entirely forgotten? Why do the descendants of the builders themselves insist that human labour alone cannot explain what their ancestors created? Perhaps the legend is simply a colourful explanation for forgotten methods, a supernatural gloss on extraordinary but mundane engineering achievement. Or perhaps the legend preserves a memory of something genuinely anomalous, something that defied ordinary explanation even at the time it occurred, something that the witnesses themselves could not understand in any terms other than magic. The stones, as always, offer no comment. The islets of Nan Madol serve different functions, and their arrangement reveals a deliberate urban planning that extended beyond simple construction to encompass social organisation, ritual practice, and political control. The complex was divided into two primary zones: Madol Poway to the southwest, which contained the administrative and priestly functions, and Madol Power to the northeast, which served mortuary and residential purposes. Canals of carefully maintained depth connected the islets, allowing canoe traffic between structures and creating a Venice-like network of waterways that served as the primary transportation infrastructure. The tide determined access. At low water, the canals became impassable, and the islets became isolated, each a fortress surrounded by exposed reef. At high tide, the city reconnected, traffic resumed, and the social and economic life of the complex could proceed. This tidal rhythm shaped every aspect of existence at Nan Madol and raises additional questions about the construction process itself. How did the builders work in an environment where the foundation flooded twice daily? How did they maintain construction progress when every high tide submerged their work site? How did they prevent the walls from shifting and settling as the underlying coral compressed and adjusted? The engineering challenges multiply the deeper one examines them, yet the walls stand, and the islets endure, and the canals still fill and empty with the breathing of the tides. The central mortuary islet, Nandawaz, represents the most impressive construction at Nan Madol and contains the deepest mysteries. The walls here reach their maximum height, enclosing a central courtyard that once contained the tombs of the Sodalur rulers. The basalt columns in this section include the largest specimens found anywhere in the complex, individual stones estimated to weigh as much as 50 tons, positioned at heights that seem to mock the limitations of muscle and rope. Within the central tomb area, archaeologists discovered evidence of elaborate burial practices, of prestige goods interred with the deceased, of rituals conducted over centuries by successive generations of priests. But they also discovered something else, something that has received less attention in mainstream publications, but that local guides mention with lowered voices when tourists are not present. Beneath the visible structures of Nandawaz, beneath the mortuary levels that archaeologists have excavated, ground-penetrating radar and underwater surveys have revealed additional chambers, submerged spaces that extend below the water table into the coral substrate itself. Some of these spaces appear to be natural voids in the reef structure. Others show geometric regularity that suggests artificial construction. The underwater exploration of Nan Madol remains in its early stages, limited by budget, by access, and by the reluctance of local authorities to permit extensive investigation. What lies beneath the visible city? Foundations? Burial chambers? Something else entirely? Divers who have explored the waters around Nan Madol report structures extending well beyond the boundaries of the recognized complex. Basalt columns lying on the lagoon floor at depth that suggest either catastrophic collapse or deliberate submersion. Some researchers have proposed that Nan Madol represents only the surviving portion of a much larger construction, that sea level rise since the medieval warm period has submerged significant sections of the original city, that what we see today is the mountaintop of an urban area that once sprawled across a much larger footprint, If true, the labour estimates would need radical revision upward, and the mystery of construction would deepen proportionally. The underwater anomalies have not been systematically surveyed. The resources required for comprehensive marine archaeology in such a remote location exceed what funding agencies have been willing to provide. The depths keep their secrets, and the questions multiply, and the official explanations grow ever more strained in their attempts to accommodate evidence that does not fit neatly into established frameworks. The abandonment of Nan Madol raises questions as troubling as its construction. The Sodalur dynasty ended in the early 17th century, overthrown by a warrior named Sokalekel who arrived, according to legend, from the island of Kosrae some 500 kilometers to the east. After the Sodalur fell, the succeeding Nanwaki dynasty chose not to occupy Nan Madol. The city was abandoned, left to the tides and the vegetation, and the slow decay of centuries. Why? Military defeat does not typically result in the complete abandonment of valuable infrastructure. Conquered capitals are usually occupied, not evacuated. Yet Nan Madol was not merely left vacant. It was avoided, shunned, treated as a place where the living should not dwell. The reasons offered in oral tradition speak of spiritual contamination, of curses laid upon the stones by the defeated Sodalur, of presences that remained after the human occupants departed. The modern inhabitants of Pohnpei continue to avoid Nan Madol after dark. Fishing boats give the islets wide berth at night. Locals who have visited the ruins during daylight hours report feelings of unease, of being watched, of sounds that have no visible source. These reports are anecdotal, subjective, impossible to verify through scientific means. They are also remarkably consistent across generations, and across individuals who have had no contact with one another. Something about Nan Madol disturbs people at a level that defies rational explanation. The physical isolation of the site amplifies its mystery. Pohnpei itself receives relatively few visitors. The island lacks the resort infrastructure of Guam or Palau, the transportation connections of Hawaii or Fiji. Reaching Nan Madol requires additional effort beyond simply arriving on Pohnpei. A drive along poorly maintained roads to the southeastern coast, a boat ride across the lagoon, a landing on coral that tears at modern footwear, a walk through vegetation that has reclaimed portions of the ancient complex. The tourists who make this journey are few, the researchers fewer still. The site has never received the attention, the funding, or the systematic investigation that its significance would seem to demand. One of the most remarkable construction achievements in human history, located in one of the most challenging environments imaginable, built by methods that remain unexplained, abandoned for reasons that remain unclear, and investigated with resources that remain insufficient. The pattern is familiar by now. The institutions that determine research priorities and allocate investigation budgets have decided, implicitly or explicitly, that Nan Madol does not merit the attention it might otherwise receive. The site remains, in the vocabulary of academic archaeology, understudied. The reasons for this understudying are never explicitly stated. Standing on the basalt walls of Nan Madol at low tide, watching the water withdraw from the canals, listening to the silence that settles over the islets when the wind drops, one cannot escape the sensation of presence. The walls rise on all sides, dark stone against tropical sky, geometric precision imposed on an environment that resists human order. The vegetation has reclaimed much of the complex, breadfruit trees and mangroves, growing from the spaces between stones, roots working their slow destruction on walls that have stood for centuries. But the walls continue to stand. The columns remain stacked. The pattern persists despite the assault of climate and time. Whatever the builders intended, whatever knowledge they possessed, whatever forces they commanded or harnessed or discovered, the evidence of their achievement endures, and the questions they raise remain unanswered, and the lagoon continues its twice-daily breathing, and the stones continue their silent testimony to capabilities that official history cannot explain. Were the builders merely clever engineers, their methods obscured by the absence of written records and the decay of organic materials? Were they participants in a broader network of ancient knowledge, a tradition of construction that extended across the Pacific and perhaps beyond? Were they, as their descendants insist, workers of magic, wielders of forces that modern science does not recognize? The basalt columns offer no answers. They simply exist, where they should not exist, in configurations that should not have been achievable, serving purposes that remain debated, created by hands whose skills have vanished from the world. The tide rises, the canals fill, the islets reconnect, and somewhere beneath the water, in chambers that have never been fully explored, the deeper mysteries of Nan Madol continue to wait. The remoteness of Pohnpei has protected Nan Madol from the tourist pressures that afflict more accessible sites, but it has also limited research in ways that serve the preservation of mystery more than its resolution. What ground-penetrating radar surveys have been conducted suggest that the visible structures represent only a portion of the total construction, that foundations extend deeper than excavation has revealed, that connected chambers and passageways may link islets beneath the water level. Marine archaeologists have documented basalt columns at depths of 30 meters and more, far below current sea level, in configurations that suggest intentional placement rather than random collapse. If these submerged structures are contemporary with the surface construction, they imply either that the builders worked underwater to depths that should have been impossible with available technology, or that sea levels have risen dramatically since the construction period, submerging what was once dry land. Neither explanation fits comfortably within established frameworks. The underwater evidence remains largely unexamined, the funding remains unavailable, the research remains undone. The official narrative accommodates what it can and ignores what it cannot, and the depths retain their secrets, patient as the stones that lie upon them. From the waters of Micronesia, from this impossible city rising from the Pacific Reef, our examination of ancient anomalies approaches its conclusion with a structure we have already encountered, but whose depths we have only begun to plumb. We return now to the Bolivian Altiplano, to the thin air and harsh sunlight of the Andes, to a site whose stonework challenges not merely our understanding of ancient logistics, but our fundamental assumptions about the relationship between technology and precision. Pumapunku sits approximately 1 kilometre southwest of the main Tiwanaku complex, a distinct construction that shares certain characteristics with its larger neighbour, while differing in ways that suggest either a different purpose, a different construction period, or a different level of technological capability. The main Tiwanaku site impresses through scale. Massive earthworks, monumental gateways, carved monoliths standing against the mountain sky. Pumapunku impresses through something else entirely. Pumapunku impresses through precision. The stone blocks that comprise the surviving structures at Pumapunku exhibit characteristics that seem anachronistic, features that belong not to the ancient world but to the machine shop, the factory floor, the precision manufacturing facility. Flat surfaces maintain tolerances measured in fractions of a millimetre across faces spanning multiple metres. 90-degree angles achieve accuracy that modern stonemasons struggle to replicate without power tools. Drill holes of consistent diameter penetrate hard andesite and diorite in patterns that suggest mechanical repeatability rather than individual handwork. The famous H-blocks, prefabricated interlocking elements that fit together like pieces of a three-dimensional puzzle, demonstrate standardization that implies mass production, that implies interchangeability of parts, that implies design principles that modern manufacturing did not develop until the Industrial Revolution. How did a civilization without metal tools, without wheels, without writing, without any of the prerequisites that modern engineering theory considers essential, achieve manufacturing precision that matches or exceeds contemporary capabilities? The question has been asked countless times. The answers that mainstream archaeology provides fall into predictable patterns: skilled craftsmen using stone tools and abrasive compounds, patient work over generations, techniques that have been lost to time but that do not require supernatural or technological explanations. These answers are not wrong precisely. Stone tools can achieve remarkable precision in skilled hands. Patient work can accomplish what seems impossible. Lost techniques need not imply unknown technologies. But the answers are also incomplete. They explain possibility without explaining probability. They demonstrate what could have been done without demonstrating what was done. The gap between possibility and probability haunts every examination of Pumapunku, every attempt to reconcile the physical evidence with the cultural context that supposedly produced it. Consider the logistics alone, separate from the precision question. The primary stone types at Pumapunku are red sandstone and andesite, with the most precisely worked blocks carved from andesite, a volcanic rock of exceptional hardness. The nearest andesite quarry lies at Cerro Sacsayhuaman, roughly 90 kilometers distant across terrain that includes ravines, seasonal rivers, and elevation changes of several hundred meters. The largest blocks at the site weigh an estimated 130 metric tons. Moving such masses across such distances would challenge modern heavy transport equipment. Moving them without wheels, without draft animals capable of sustained heavy labor at altitude, without paved roads, without cranes or mechanical advantage beyond the most basic levers and rollers, this moves from the improbable toward the seemingly impossible. And yet the stones are there. Their quarry origin has been confirmed through geological analysis. The distance they travelled is not speculation, but measured fact. Whatever methods transported them, those methods worked. They worked reliably enough to move not one exceptional block, but hundreds, enough to construct an entire complex, enough to execute a building program that required sustained coordination over years or decades. The how remains elusive. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated that large stones can be moved using log rollers, inclined planes, and coordinated human labour. But these demonstrations typically involve much smaller masses, much shorter distances, much more favourable terrain. Scaling the techniques to Pumapunku's reality introduces complications that multiply rather than add. 100 workers pulling a 10-ton block across a prepared surface is one thing. 1,000 workers pulling a 130-ton block up a mountainside is something qualitatively different, not merely quantitatively larger. The organisational requirements alone, feeding, housing, coordinating, motivating such a workforce at an altitude where oxygen is scarce and agriculture is marginal, suggest a civilization of considerable sophistication, considerable resources, considerable ambition. This civilization supposedly lacked writing. The Tiwanaku culture left no deciphered texts, no administrative records, no instructions for future generations. Whatever knowledge enabled their achievements passed through oral tradition, through apprenticeship, through methods that left no permanent trace. When the civilization collapsed, the knowledge collapsed with it, vanishing as completely as if it had never existed. The silence of the record is itself an anomaly. Civilizations of comparable complexity elsewhere in the ancient world left extensive documentation. Egypt covered its monuments with hieroglyphics explaining their construction, their purpose, their builders' names and deeds. Mesopotamia recorded everything from temple inventories to brewing recipes on clay tablets that survived millennia. Rome inscribed its engineering achievements on the structures themselves, commemorating both the builders and the built. Tiwanaku left stone. Only stone. Stone so precisely worked that it seems to speak for itself, to require no explanation, to stand as its own testament. But stone without context is stone without meaning, and the meaning of Pumapunku remains as elusive as its methods. The precision question cuts deeper than logistics. Transporting large stones is merely difficult. Achieving the tolerances evident at Pumapunku approaches the inexplicable. Flat surfaces extending 2 meters or more maintain deviation from true plane of less than 1/10 of a millimeter. Right angles achieve accuracy within 1 or 2 arc minutes. Parallel drill holes of identical diameter penetrate the stone at consistent depths, with spacing that varies by less than a millimeter across multiple iterations. Modern precision manufacturing achieves such tolerances through machine tools, computer-controlled cutting heads, diamond-tipped drills, laser-guided positioning systems. These tools represent centuries of technological development, the accumulated knowledge of the Industrial Revolution and everything that followed. They require electricity, require metallurgy, require the entire infrastructure of technological civilization. The Tiwanaku had none of this. The Tiwanaku, according to established understanding, had stone tools, copper alloys, and patience. And somehow, with these primitive resources, they achieved results that modern engineers approach with respect bordering on disbelief. One explanation holds that the precision has been overstated, that enthusiastic alternative researchers have measured selectively, have photographed favourable examples while ignoring contrary evidence. There is some truth to this. Not every block at Pumapunku exhibits exceptional precision. Many show rough surfaces, approximate angles, work that would not seem out of place at any ancient site. The argument suggests that the famous images, the viral photographs of impossibly flat surfaces and perfect right angles, represent exceptional pieces that survived earthquake and erosion, while lesser work did not. creating a biased sample that overstates the overall quality of construction? Perhaps. But the exceptional pieces exist. However they came to dominate the photographic record, their precision is real, measurable, verified by multiple independent examinations. Even if 90% of Pumapunku's stonework was merely competent, the remaining 10% still demands explanation. How did ancient craftsmen achieve even occasional results that modern stonemasons struggle to match with power tools? What techniques, what knowledge, what approaches permitted accuracy that seems to belong to another technological era entirely? Experimental archaeologists have proposed various methods. Flat surfaces can be achieved through patient abrasion, grinding stone against stone with wet sand as an intermediate medium. The process is slow but effective, gradually removing material until the surface approaches true plane. Checking accuracy is possible through simple methods: a straight edge made of tight-grained wood, water pooled on the surface to reveal any high spots, reflection of light to detect irregularities invisible to direct examination. Right angles can be established through geometric principles that require no advanced mathematics, the basic relationships known to any culture that practices weaving or construction. Drill holes can be created using hollow tubes of bamboo or reed, rotated against the stone with abrasive slurry. These methods work. Laboratory demonstrations have produced respectable results, using nothing beyond Stone Age technology. The question is whether they work well enough, whether they work efficiently enough, whether they can be scaled to the industrial level that Pumapunku's construction implies. Creating a single flat surface through patient abrasion might require weeks of labour. Creating hundreds of such surfaces, all to consistent specifications, all fitting together in predetermined patterns. This multiplies the timeline into decades, into lifetimes, into generational projects that span centuries. Time was available. The Tiwanaku civilization flourished for roughly 600 years before its collapse around 1000 CE. Generational projects were not merely possible, but common in the ancient world. Egypt's pyramids, Rome's aqueducts, medieval Europe's cathedrals, all required sustained commitment across generations, all demonstrate what determined cultures can accomplish when timelines extend beyond individual lifespans. Yet the scale of Pumapunku's precision raises questions that time alone cannot answer. It is not merely that the work would have taken long, it is that the standards maintained throughout suggest quality control, suggest inspection protocols, suggest systems for ensuring that each element met specifications before integration into the larger whole. Such systems require measurement, comparison, documentation, administrative infrastructure that leaves traces. Where are the traces at Pumapunku? Where are the failed attempts, the rejected blocks, the workshop debris that should accumulate around any manufacturing centre? Where are the comparative standards, the reference pieces, the tools of verification? The archaeological record is silent. The stones speak of precision achieved. They say nothing of precision measured, verified, maintained. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed complexities beneath the surface that add additional layers to the mystery. The visible ruins of Pumapunku represent only a fraction of the total construction. Foundations extend underground, their full extent unmapped and unexcavated. Chambers and tunnels appear on radar returns, their purposes unknown, their contents unexplored. A sophisticated network of water channels runs beneath and between structures, suggesting hydraulic engineering of considerable complexity. The Tiwanaku understood water. This much is clear from multiple sites across the Altiplano. Their agricultural systems employed raised fields that manipulated water tables, that used thermal mass of water-filled channels to moderate temperature extremes, that demonstrated understanding of hydrology that modern agronomists have only recently begun to appreciate. At Tiwanaku proper, the Akapana pyramid incorporates internal drainage systems of impressive sophistication, channels that directed rainwater through the structure's interior in patterns that may have served ritual as well as practical purposes. This same hydraulic knowledge appears at Pumapunku in forms that excavation has only partially revealed. Water moved through the site, moved beneath it, moved in ways that current understanding cannot fully reconstruct. What purposes did this water serve? Practical needs, drinking, cleaning, agriculture, cannot explain the complexity. The channels were overbuilt for simple utility, engineered beyond any practical requirement. Ritual purposes seem more likely, water as a sacred element, its controlled flow a form of worship or communication. But ritual purposes do not explain the precision of the channels, the careful gradients that maintained flow rates, the connections between separated structures that suggest a unified hydraulic design spanning the entire complex. Whoever built Puma Punku thought in systems. They conceived not individual buildings but integrated installations, elements that functioned together, that depended on each other, that formed a coherent whole greater than the sum of its parts. This systems thinking implies planning documents, design specifications, coordination mechanisms that should have left material traces. The traces remain unfound. Either they never existed, the entire complex designed and held in memory, transmitted through oral instruction alone, or they existed in forms that have not survived. Organic materials perished, metal artifacts looted, written records in media that decomposed without trace. Neither explanation satisfies. Civilizations that build at this level do not typically rely on memory alone, and materials durable enough to record precision specifications do not typically vanish completely. This site lies partially destroyed, partially buried, partially unexcavated. Spanish colonial authorities quarried the ruins for building material. Local farmers used the stones for fences and foundations. Treasure hunters dug through the debris seeking gold and silver that the Tiwanaku apparently never possessed. Each disturbance erased evidence, scrambled context, made reconstruction increasingly difficult. What remains is a puzzle with most of its pieces missing, a text with most of its pages torn away. The surviving elements hint at a whole that can no longer be perceived, a design that can no longer be reconstructed, an achievement that can no longer be fully assessed. Standing amid the ruins today, one confronts stones that seem to belong to another technological era entirely. H-blocks designed for interlocking assembly, their tenons and mortises machined to tolerances that imply mass production, flat surfaces that reflect the Andean light like dark mirrors, drill holes that penetrate the hardest stone with surgical precision. Whatever civilization created these works understood principles that modern engineering theory considers the province of the machine age, the factory age, the era of standardization and interchangeability. Either these principles emerged independently at different points in human history, appearing in the Andes millennia before their rediscovery in industrial Europe, or our understanding of technological development is fundamentally flawed, or something happened here that current knowledge cannot accommodate. The official narrative does its best. It speaks of skilled craftsmen, patient labour, techniques lost to time. It invokes stone tools and abrasive powders, centuries of accumulated experience, methods that need not have survived the civilization's collapse. The narrative is internally consistent. It violates no physical laws. It requires no intervention by unknown forces, no lost technologies, no contact with beings beyond the human. It asks only that we accept a level of ancient capability that seems difficult to credit, that seems at odds with everything else we know about pre-Columbian South American technology. We are asked to believe that the same culture that never developed the wheel, never developed writing, never developed metal tools harder than bronze, somehow developed precision manufacturing techniques that match or exceed modern capabilities. We are asked to believe that this knowledge existed, flourished, and vanished without leaving any trace of its methods. We are asked to believe that the gap between demonstrated result and expected capability is explained entirely by lost techniques, by approaches we cannot recover because they were never recorded. Perhaps this is true. Perhaps lost knowledge explains everything, and the mystery will remain simply because the answers perished with their keepers. But standing at Puma Punku, confronting stones that seem to demand mechanical explanation, one cannot help but wonder whether the official narrative has missed something essential, whether assumptions about ancient capability have constrained interpretations beyond their proper scope, whether the truth of this place lies somewhere the conventional story does not reach. Our journey has traversed continents and millennia, from the oldest known temple complex at Göbekli Tepe to the impossibly precise stonework of Puma Punku, from the subterranean labyrinth of Derinkuyu to the floating city of Nan Madol. Each site presents its own anomalies, its own challenges to established understanding, its own questions that official explanations fail to fully answer. Yet certain threads weave through all of them. Certain patterns recur with troubling consistency. Everywhere we have looked, we have found precision exceeding expectation, logistics defying explanation, knowledge that appeared fully formed and vanished without descendant. The builders of these sites left stone but not secrets, monuments but not manuals, achievements but not approaches. They worked at scales that should have required infrastructure they apparently did not possess. They demonstrated knowledge that should have been impossible without prerequisites they apparently lacked. They created and then they disappeared, abandoning their works to time and erosion, to conquest and colonial quarrying, to the slow grinding of millennia. Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried. Tiwanaku collapsed into obscurity. Derinkuyu was sealed and forgotten. Nanmadol was abandoned to the ghosts that locals insist still inhabit its ruins. In each case, the builders departed and took their secrets with them, leaving behind only questions that subsequent centuries have failed to answer. What are we to make of these accumulated mysteries? The institutions charged with explaining the past have developed narratives for each site, explanations that satisfy academic requirements without fully satisfying curiosity. The narratives work within certain assumptions about human capability, about technological development, about the linear progression from primitive to sophisticated that underlies most historical thinking. When evidence challenges these assumptions, the narratives accommodate through familiar mechanisms: lost techniques, exceptional skill, patient labour over generations. These mechanisms explain how without explaining why, how methods might have been developed without explaining why they were developed so early and so fully, how knowledge might have existed without explaining why it vanished so completely. The mechanisms preserve the underlying model of human history while acknowledging that certain details remain unclear. They maintain institutional credibility while admitting institutional incompleteness. But the incompleteness accumulates. One site with unexplained features might represent an anomaly within a generally sound framework. 2 sites suggest a pattern. 4 sites, each on different continents, each from different cultures, each supposedly isolated from the others, suggest that the framework itself may require revision. The coincidences are too numerous. The gaps are too consistent. The silence of the record is too profound. Something is missing from the story we tell ourselves about our past. Something important. Something that these sites preserve in stone while documentation has failed to preserve in words. What might that something be? Speculation ranges from the plausible to the fantastic, from lost civilizations that preceded known history to extraterrestrial intervention in human development. The extremes of this spectrum need not detain us, but somewhere between the extremes lies territory worth exploring, possibilities worth considering. Perhaps human capability in remote antiquity was greater than we credit, the cognitive and organizational resources available to early societies exceeding what archaeological evidence has led us to believe. Perhaps techniques existed that required no metal tools, no written instructions, no infrastructure that leaves material traces, and these techniques achieved results that seem impossible only because we have failed to rediscover them. Perhaps connections existed between distant cultures that conventional history does not recognize. Trade networks or migration patterns that permitted knowledge transfer across distances that should have been unbridgeable. Perhaps the timeline of human development is wrong in fundamental ways, major achievements pushed back by millennia from their currently assigned dates. Sophisticated civilizations existing in periods we have classified as primitive. Any of these possibilities, if true, would require revision of established understanding. All of them face the same obstacle: absence of confirming evidence beyond the structures themselves. The stones speak, but they speak only of results. They say nothing of methods, nothing of timelines, nothing of the cultural context that produced them. The questions they pose may never receive definitive answers, and perhaps that is the point. Perhaps these sites serve as permanent reminders of how little we truly know about our own species' past, how much has been lost, how much may never be recovered. They stand as monuments not merely to ancient achievement but to modern humility, testaments to the limits of archaeology, the limits of reconstruction, the limits of understanding across the vast gulf of time. They remind us that the past is not simply a lesser version of the present, that ancient peoples were not simply primitive versions of ourselves, that capabilities we have lost may have been as remarkable as capabilities we have gained. The story of human civilization is not a simple progression from ignorance to knowledge, from primitive to sophisticated, from unable to able. It is a more complex narrative, full of discontinuities and reversals, peaks and collapses, achievements that flourished and vanished and may never flourish again. The precision of Pumapunku, the scale of Göbekli Tepe, the depth of Derinkuyu, the impossibility of Nanmadol, these are chapters in that larger story, chapters whose full text we cannot read, whose meaning we can only approximate. The sites wait. They have waited for millennia already. They will wait for millennia more. They do not demand that we understand them. They do not require our explanations. They simply exist, stone confronting time, form persisting through collapse and conquest, precision surviving the dissolution of the hands that created it. Whatever secrets they hold patiently, without urgency, without need for human validation. We are the ones who feel the need to explain, to understand, to fit the evidence into frameworks that make sense to us. The sites feel no such need. They are complete in themselves, finished, whole. The mystery belongs to us, not to them. In the end, we are left where we began, with questions that resist resolution, with evidence that exceeds explanation, with stones that speak of knowledge we do not possess. The official narratives offer what comfort they can, the familiar comfort of the comprehensible, the categorized, the controlled. But the sites themselves offer something different, something older and stranger, the discomfort of the unknown, the vertigo of standing before achievements that should not exist, the humbling recognition that human beings once did things we cannot do and may never be able to do again. This is not comfortable knowledge. It does not fit neatly into the progressive story of human advancement that modern culture prefers. It suggests that history is not a ladder, but a maze, not an ascent, but a wandering, full of wrong turns and dead ends and paths that led somewhere remarkable before closing forever behind those who walked them. The night air of the Altiplano is thin and cold, the stars burning with fierce clarity through atmosphere too sparse to dim them. The ruins of Pumapunku lie scattered beneath that ancient light, blocks and fragments that once formed a coherent whole, a design whose purpose has been lost along with its method. Somewhere beneath the surface, chambers and channels wait to be mapped, their purposes to be debated by researchers who will never know for certain whether their guesses approach the truth. Somewhere in the deeper past, hands shaped these stones with precision that modern hands struggle to match, minds conceived designs that modern minds cannot fully reconstruct. Those hands are dust now, those minds silence. Only the stones remain, and the questions they embody. There are places where the earth remembers what humanity has forgotten, where stone preserves what documents have failed to record, where the past refuses to remain past because its achievements still stand, still challenge, still demand accounting. Göbekli Tepe rises from its Turkish hilltop, its animal carvings facing a world that would not develop writing for another 6,000 years. Derinkuyu plunges into darkness beneath the Cappadocian plateau, its chambers and tunnels echoing with the footsteps of refugees who fled dangers lost to history. Nanmadol crumbles into its Pacific lagoon, its basalt columns sinking into waters that remember construction they did not witness. Pumapunku lies scattered across its Andean platform, its precision surviving the destruction of everything that might explain it. These places are not answers. They are questions given physical form, mysteries embodied in stone, reminders that the past was larger and stranger, and more capable than the stories we tell about it. They wait for those willing to look without explaining away, to wonder without concluding, to accept the limits of knowledge without surrendering the desire to know. The stones have kept their secrets for thousands of years. They will keep them a while longer yet, patient as the earth that holds them, silent as the builders who shaped them, eternal as the questions they pose to every generation that stands before them and asks with humility and wonder, what hands made this, and how, and why, and where did they go when the work was done?